My name is Hope Jackson, and at 32, I thought I understood the rhythms of Iron Mountain Hospital in Granite Ridge, Wyoming. As a charge nurse in the cardiac unit, I'd spent 6 years navigating the delicate balance between patient care and hospital politics. The morning mountain air that swept through our valley usually brought clarity, but lately, something felt different in the sterile corridors of our 200-bed facility. It started with small things, conversations that stopped when I entered the break room, emails that seemed to take longer to reach me than my colleagues, schedule changes that somehow bypassed my usual notifications in our Epic system. Hannah Morrison, our recovery room nurse supervisor, had always been meticulous about communication protocols, so these lapses seemed uncharacteristic. Hannah had been my mentor when I first arrived from Denver, fresh out of my BSN program. She'd guided me through the complexities of rural healthcare, where every decision carried weight in our tight-knit community. Her 20 years of experience at Iron Mountain made her invaluable, and her position gave her significant influence over staffing decisions and disciplinary recommendations. The first real sign came during a routine staff meeting. Dr. Isaac Harrison, our chief of cardiology, mentioned a quality improvement initiative that I'd apparently been excluded from. When I asked Hannah about it later, she claimed there had been a miscommunication, that my name had somehow been left off the distribution list. Her explanation felt rehearsed, her usual warmth replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Then there were the incident reports. 3 separate occasions where my documentation had been questioned, each time by different department heads who claimed they'd received concerns about my charting practices. When I requested copies of these reports through proper channels, they seemed to vanish into administrative limbo. Hannah assured me she was looking into it, that these things happen sometimes with our new electronic systems. The badge access log showed irregularities too. My key card had been used to enter areas during times I wasn't even in the hospital. Yet when I brought this to security, they claimed the timestamps must be system errors. Hannah nodded sympathetically when I mentioned it, suggesting that our aging infrastructure often created these glitches. Other staff members began treating me differently. Isaac Thompson from pharmacy started double-checking my medication orders, something he'd never done before. Hannah Rodriguez from lab would barely make eye contact during our usual morning rounds. Even the housekeeping staff seemed to avoid my unit, leaving tasks incomplete that they'd normally handle without question. The isolation was subtle but systematic. Committee assignments I'd held for years were quietly redistributed. My input on policy changes was no longer requested. Training opportunities that should have been offered to all charge nurses somehow never reached my desk. Each time I questioned these oversights, Hannah had reasonable explanations, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. During one particularly busy shift, I overheard Hannah on a phone call in her office. The door was slightly ajar, and her voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. Calculating, almost cold. She was discussing, quote, problematic staff members and documentation issues with someone, though she ended the call abruptly when she noticed me passing by. The breaking point came when I discovered that my annual performance review had been delayed indefinitely. Hannah claimed there were, quote, concerns that needed to be addressed before the evaluation could proceed, but she remained vague about the specifics. When I pressed for details, she suggested that perhaps I should consider whether Iron Mountain was still the right fit for my career goals. That night, as I drove home through the winding mountain roads, the pieces began forming a picture I didn't want to see. The woman who had welcomed me, trained me, and supported my growth was somehow at the center of a web that seemed designed to push me out. But why? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, I arrived early to review my access logs more carefully, and what I found made my blood run cold. The access logs told a story I wished I couldn't read. My badge had been used to enter restricted areas during shifts when I was documented as being in patient care. Medication room entries at times when I was clearly charting in the nurse's station. Most damning of all, computer logins from terminals I'd never touched, all occurring during Hannah's shifts. I printed the reports with shaking hands, cross-referencing them with my patient assignments and break schedules. The pattern was meticulous. Someone had been using my credentials systematically, creating a digital trail that painted me as either grossly negligent or deliberately deceptive. The sophistication of it took my breath away. Hannah had been my mentor for 3 years. When I'd started at Iron Mountain, fresh out of nursing school, she'd taken me under her wing, during those overwhelming first months. She'd taught me how to navigate the complex dynamics of post-surgical care, how to read the subtle signs that distinguished normal recovery from potential complications. More than that, she'd helped me understand the unwritten rules of hospital politics, which doctors preferred direct communication, which administrators responded better to formal requests, how to advocate for patients without stepping on territorial toes. Our relationship had evolved beyond professional mentorship into something resembling friendship. We'd shared coffee during quiet night shifts, discussing everything from challenging cases to personal struggles. When my father had his heart attack last year, Hannah had personally rearranged the schedule so I could take extended leave. She'd even visited him during his recovery, bringing flowers and that warm smile that made everyone feel cared for. The recovery room was Hannah's domain, and she ruled it with competent authority. As the senior nurse with over 15 years of experience, she had significant influence over staffing decisions, policy implementations, and disciplinary recommendations. Her word carried weight with administration, and her evaluations could make or break a career. I'd always admired her ability to balance compassion with efficiency, never realizing how that same skill set could be weaponized. Looking back, I could trace the beginning of my troubles to about 6 months ago, right after I'd been selected for the charge nurse position. Hannah had congratulated me publicly, but there had been something in her expression, a flicker of something I'd dismissed as surprise. She'd been passed over for a similar promotion the year before, something she'd mentioned only once, claiming she preferred the hands-on patient care of her current role. The first incident had seemed like a simple miscommunication. A post-operative patient had been given the wrong pain medication dosage. Not dangerous, but enough to require an incident report. The error had been traced back to an order that appeared to come from my terminal, though I had no memory of entering it. Hannah had been sympathetic, suggesting that the stress of my new responsibilities might be affecting my attention to detail. She'd even offered to help me develop better documentation habits. Similar incidents had followed with increasing frequency. Medication discrepancies, scheduling conflicts, missing documentation, all minor issues individually, but collectively painting a picture of declining competence. Each time, Hannah had been there with understanding and support, offering to help me get back on track while simultaneously documenting every mistake from my personnel file. The isolation campaign had been equally subtle. Hannah had a gift for making exclusion seem natural. When planning committee meetings were scheduled, she'd mention them to other staff members in casual conversation, somehow always forgetting to include me. Training opportunities were discussed in groups where I wasn't present, then later dismissed as not really relevant to my current role when I inquired about them. She'd also begun subtly undermining my authority as charge nurse. When I'd make decisions about patient assignments or resource allocation, she'd question them publicly, framing her concerns as helpful suggestions while planting seeds of doubt about my judgment. Other staff members, particularly newer nurses who looked up to her, began second-guessing my directives and seeking her approval instead. The most insidious part was how she'd positioned herself as my advocate. During informal conversations with other staff, she'd express concern about my recent struggles, always with the caveat that she was trying to help me succeed. This created an atmosphere where my colleagues felt they were being supportive by treating me with kid gloves, when, in reality, they were reinforcing the narrative that I was failing. I'd started keeping detailed notes about these incidents, initially thinking I was being paranoid. But the documentation revealed a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Hannah's shifts correlated perfectly with the timing of my supposed mistakes. Her presence at key meetings where my competence was questioned. Her convenient availability to offer solutions that somehow never quite worked. The breakthrough came when I decided to review the hospital's internal communication system more carefully. As charge nurse, I had access to administrative messaging logs, something I'd never thought to examine before. What I found there made everything else pale in comparison. Hannah had been systematically manipulating organizational communications to isolate and target not just me, but several other staff members over the past 2 years. She'd been intercepting emails about opportunities and redirecting them away from certain individuals. She'd been creating false documentation about performance issues and circulating them to key decision makers. Most shocking of all, she'd been using her access to personnel files to gather information that she then used to undermine people's credibility. The scope was breathtaking. Isaac Thompson from pharmacy hadn't been double-checking my orders because he doubted my competence. He'd been told by Hannah that there were concerns about accuracy that required additional verification. Hannah Rodriguez from lab had been avoiding me because Hannah had suggested that I was going through some personal issues that made me difficult to work with. Even the housekeeping staff had been redirected away from my unit based on fabricated complaints about my unreasonable demands. She'd been playing a long game, systematically removing anyone who might threaten her position or question her authority. The recovery room nurse who'd been there before me had left suddenly last year, citing, quote, personality conflicts that now seemed suspiciously orchestrated. A promising new graduate had transferred to another department after just 6 months, claiming the environment was, quote, too stressful. Another victim of Hannah's manipulation. The gore was overwhelming, but I knew that confronting her directly would be futile. Hannah was too skilled at manipulation to simply confess when cornered. Instead, she'd likely turn the situation around, suggesting that my accusations were of the mental instability she'd been documenting. I needed allies, and I needed to be strategic about how I proceeded. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd taught me about hospital politics was about to get a lesson in how those same skills could be used against her. But first, I had to figure out who I could trust in an environment where Hannah's influence ran so deep. As I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, staring at the printed spread across my passenger seat, I realized that everything I'd believed about my professional relationships had been carefully constructed lies. The question now was whether I had the courage to tear down those lies and expose the truth, knowing that Hannah's retaliation would be swift and merciless. The mountain air felt thin as I took a deep breath and made my decision. The next morning, I arrived at Iron Mountain Hospital with a plan that felt both terrifying and necessary. The printed sat in a sealed envelope in my locker, but I knew documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed someone in administration who could see past Hannah's carefully constructed facade. My first stop was Isaac Thompson from Human Resources. I'd worked with him on several policy reviews, and he'd always struck me as methodical and fair. When I knocked on his office door at 7:30, he looked surprised but welcomed me in. "Hope, you're here early. Everything all right?" I closed the door behind me and took the seat across from his desk. "Isaac, I need to report a serious concern about workplace harassment and manipulation of hospital communications." His expression shifted to professional attention. "Tell me what's happening." I laid out the systematically, the intercepted emails, the pattern of isolation, the documented lies about my performance and mental state. Isaac listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "These are serious allegations," he said when I finished. "Hannah Harris has been here for 15 years and has an exemplary record." "That's exactly what makes her so effective," I replied. "She understands the system well enough to manipulate it without leaving obvious traces." Isaac leaned back in his chair. "I'll need to involve our compliance officer and possibly legal. This kind of investigation requires careful handling." Within an hour, I found myself in a conference room with Isaac, Diana Martinez from compliance, and Catherine Foster, the hospital's legal counsel. The atmosphere was formal but not hostile. They were taking my concerns seriously. "We'll need to conduct interviews with the staff members you've mentioned," Diana explained. "But we have to be careful not to compromise the investigation or create additional workplace." Over the next 3 days, the investigation unfolded quietly. I continued my regular shifts, but I could sense Hannah's growing awareness that something had shifted. She approached me twice, fishing for information with casual questions about whether I'd been feeling better and if I needed any additional support. The breakthrough came when Isaac interviewed Dr. Rodriguez from the lab. Apparently, Hannah had been more careless with him, explicitly stating that I was unreliable and suggesting that he should keep an eye on my work quality. When pressed for specifics, she couldn't provide any concrete examples of errors or problems. Catherine Foster called me into her office on Thursday afternoon. "We've found enough to support your claims," she said. "Hannah's communications show a clear pattern of deliberate misinformation designed to isolate you professionally. What happens now?" "She's being placed on administrative leave pending a full review," We're also conducting a broader audit of her communications over the past 2 years to identify any other potential victims. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Hannah wouldn't go quietly. Sure enough, within hours of her suspension, I received a text message from an unknown number. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started." Isaac assured me that the hospital security team was aware of the situation and that any retaliation would result in immediate termination and possible legal action. Still, I found myself looking over my shoulder and double-checking my car locks. The investigation revealed even more than I'd suspected. Hannah had been manipulating communications for years, targeting anyone she perceived as a threat to her authority. The recovery room nurse who'd left the previous year had been subjected to similar treatment, as had 2 other staff members who'd transferred to different departments. Most disturbing was the discovery that Hannah had been accessing Employee Assistance Program records without authorization, using confidential information about staff members' personal struggles to craft more effective psychological manipulation strategies. She violated every principle of professional ethics, Diana told me during one of our follow-up meetings. The scope of her misconduct is unprecedented in my experience. The formal disciplinary hearing took place 2 weeks later. Hannah arrived with a lawyer and maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that her communications had been misinterpreted and that she'd only been trying to maintain professional standards. But the Marine was overwhelming. Email logs, witness statements, and the pattern of behavior painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and abuse of authority. The hearing panel, composed of senior administrators and medical staff, deliberated for less than an hour. Hannah Harris was terminated immediately, with cause. Her nursing license would be reported to the state board for review, and she was banned from hospital property. The decision was final and non-appealable. As I walked out of the administrative building that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. The mountain air seemed cleaner, and the familiar sounds of the hospital felt welcoming rather than threatening. Isaac caught up with me in the parking lot. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I have in a long time," I said. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for having the courage to come. We're implementing new oversight procedures to prevent this kind of abuse in the future." The next few weeks brought a gradual return to normal workplace relationships. Colleagues who'd been distant began approaching me again, many apologizing for believing Hannah's lies without question. Dr. Rodriguez from the lab was particularly apologetic, admitting that he'd been uncomfortable with Hannah's suggestions, but hadn't known how to address them. But the most significant change was in my own confidence. I'd faced down a master manipulator and won, not through politics or games, but through truth. And the experience had taught me that even the most sophisticated deception could be unraveled with patience and courage. Hannah's replacement, a soft-spoken nurse named Catherine Williams, brought a completely different energy to the recovery unit. She focused on patient care and staff support, rather than power games, and the entire department seemed to exhale collectively. 3 months after Hannah's termination, I received a call from the state nursing board. Hannah had appealed their decision to suspend her license, claiming that she'd been the victim of a conspiracy. The board wanted my testimony for their final hearing. Standing in that hearing room, facing Hannah one last time, I felt no anger or fear, only a quiet determination to ensure that she couldn't harm other healthcare professionals. Her lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, but the UWILN spoke for itself. The board upheld their decision. Hannah's nursing license was permanently revoked. As I drove home from the state capitol that evening, watching the Wyoming mountains fade into twilight, I realized that the ordeal had fundamentally changed me. I was no longer the trusting, somewhat naive nurse who'd arrived at Iron Mountain Hospital 2 years earlier. I was stronger, more aware, and absolutely committed to protecting others from the kind of professional betrayal I'd experienced. The silence in my car felt different now. Not the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful calm of justice served. 12 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Wyoming Hospital Association, presenting the final draft of our new whistleblower protection protocols to a room full of administrators and nursing directors. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I'd been fighting for my professional survival, and now I was helping reshape how hospitals across the state handled staff concerns. My new position as patient safety coordinator at Iron Mountain Hospital had evolved beyond anything I'd imagined. After Hannah's case made waves through the state healthcare community, hospital leadership recognized the need for systemic change. They'd asked me to develop comprehensive policies that would prevent the kind of retaliation and manipulation I'd experienced. The protocols we'd created were thorough: anonymous reporting systems, mandatory training on professional conduct, and most importantly, clear consequences for staff who used their positions to target colleagues. I helped develop systems that prevent retaliation against staff reporting concerns, ensuring that no other healthcare professional would face the isolation and professional sabotage that had nearly destroyed my career. Dr. Martinez had been promoted to chief medical officer, and his first initiative was implementing these new safeguards hospital-wide. Isaac Thompson remained my strongest ally, now serving as the staff liaison for our safety committee. Together, we'd created something meaningful from the wreckage Hannah had left behind. The recovery unit thrived under Catherine Williams' leadership. Patient satisfaction scores had improved dramatically, and staff turnover had dropped to nearly zero. The toxic atmosphere that had poisoned the department for so long was just a memory now. I still received occasional updates about Hannah through the healthcare grapevine. She'd moved to another state, working in a non-clinical role at a medical supply company. Her nursing license remained revoked, and the professional references from Iron Mountain Hospital ensured she'd never work in patient care again. Sometimes, walking through the hospital corridors where I'd once felt so isolated and afraid, I marveled at how completely everything had changed. The same badge readers, the same epic workstations, the same break rooms, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Trust had been rebuilt, communication had improved, and staff felt safe, reporting concerns without fear of retaliation. My phone buzzed with a text from Isaac. "Great presentation today. Dinner to celebrate?" I smiled, remembering how he'd been the only one willing to stand with me during those dark months. Our friendship had deepened through the ordeal, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to doing what was right. As I packed up my presentation materials, I thought about the young nurses just starting their careers at Iron Mountain Hospital. They'd never know how close this place had come to being consumed by one person's manipulation and cruelty. The systems we'd built would protect them, ensuring that their focus remained where it belonged, on patient care and professional growth. The Wyoming mountains were visible through the conference room windows, their peaks touched with early snow. This landscape had witnessed my lowest moments and my greatest triumph. I'd found my voice here, learned to fight for truth, and discovered strength I never knew I possessed. Walking to my car in the crisp autumn air, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning trauma into purpose. Hannah's betrayal had nearly broken me, but it had also revealed my capacity for resilience and leadership. The experience had transformed not just my career but my entire understanding of what it meant to be a healthcare professional. The drive home was peaceful, the radio playing softly as the hospital disappeared in my rearview mirror. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and support my colleagues, new chances to ensure that truth prevailed over manipulation. I pulled into my driveway as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The house was quiet, welcoming, a sanctuary I'd fought hard to preserve. Inside, I poured a glass of wine and settled into my favorite chair, finally allowing myself to fully appreciate how far I'd come. The ordeal that had begun with subtle signs of wrongdoing and escalated into a full-scale assault on my professional reputation was truly behind me now. Justice had been served, systems had been changed, and lives had been protected. The silence that surrounded me now wasn't the oppressive quiet of isolation, but the peaceful calm of a battle won and a mission accomplished. It was finally over, and the silence felt earned.